Hello and welcome to the BHDDA and ARC of Michigan PCP webinar series. We will be starting here shortly at 3 o'clock. We're going to give people just a few more minutes to join in. Today is part 2 of the Self-Direction Technical Requirement Implementation Guide, and we will just wait a few more minutes then for people to join in. Okay, it is 3 o'clock, so welcome everyone. Again, this is part 2 of our Self-Direction Technical Requirement Implementation Guide. Today, our presenters are Laura Demuse and Marie Eagle.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I guess it's 3 o'clock, so we'll get going. This is again part 2 of the Self-Direction Technical Requirement FAQ. So hopefully you guys are all ready for some good information. So today is kind of a continuation of the last training that we had. So we have links to the guidance and the policy that was signed into contract on January 31st. Want to kind of head off this training letting you guys know that, you know, some of this information might be new to some people. Some of it, hopefully a lot of it is old. It really is the same thing we've been doing for 20 plus years, just kind of presented hopefully in a more clear and concise way. And in order for us to really help the field and people have real self-determined lives, we really need your help and your buy-in. And so we ask you to kind of keep an open mind and really approach all of this with thinking about how to help make it work instead of kind of coming at it from a point of view that, you know, well, this doesn't match what I understand. This isn't the traditional way we do services. It's because it's not the traditional way we do services. So it's an alternative service delivery model, and that's the whole point. So the point of these trainings is to really help everybody learn how to eliminate the barriers that a lot of people make the mistake of throwing in the way of having people have real choice and control over their services and being able to manage a budget. So let's get started. So an overview of what we're going to go over today. We're going to do a slight recap of some of the stuff that we talked about last time. We'll go through all of the different agreements that need to be signed when you start an arrangement. We're kind of starting off, if you remember in the process, we left off kind of after assessment pre-planning in the planning meeting. And so we're going to kind of continue in the process and where all of those self-directed services fall in. We're going to kind of go over the budget some more, talk about some roles and responsibilities, the ongoing employee training. So once you get somebody through the door, they're qualified to actually be a provider, what you have to do to maintain that. Communication, which is very key and vital to making all of this work, and some prevention that's in the guide. And then we'll go into the FAQs that were left over from last time. So, like I said, we kind of did in the first section, these first 3 steps, learning and assessing, pre-planning, and then we kind of go into the main planning meeting, and really in a self-directed service arrangement, you should have planning meetings because there's more involved than just kind of developing that plan of service. So once we get into that final stage, we're going to, the authorization of the plan, implementation and monitoring. So at this point, you should have your plan of service done, a budget, you have a spending plan. So this is again how the person has decided through that person-centered planning process they want to spend the money in their budget. Last time I was talking about kind of a lump sum or a whole dollar amount, and that's what we talk about when the person is talking about their budget. We're talking about dollars. When you're talking from a CMH standpoint on the back end, we still have claims and units and all that, but that's in the background. The person doesn't need to worry about any of that. They're only talking about using dollars. So we'll kind of get into that some more. Again, going over those agreements and a job description if people are direct hiring, the training that somebody's going to do, either they need training themselves on, being a good employer, or maybe any extra training that they would like for their staff, hiring, and then starting the arrangement. So these are kind of all the things that are happening, and sometimes they're kind of overlapping, but these are all things that need to happen to get the arrangement started. So, move my screen here. So at this point, you're determining the needs. We're going back for the recap now. So in learning and assessing as part of your person-centered planning process, you're really in that determining needs phase. So things are kind of being viewed in that traditional sense right now, right? You look at, the system tends to look at like, where can this person be placed? What services can be matched their needs? What is the system going to do with them, right? These are the questions that are answered through the recommendations made by your planning team, and they represent the overall needs of what the person is eligible for. And this is the first piece of information that's used to guide the planning process and then establish the parameters for that individual budget. So once there are assessed recommendations for services, there's an overall picture of that person's level of care. And then the service-driven system can offer this person like this rough idea of what utilizing all those recommendations from the system, what they're eligible for, what their needs are, and you get kind of an overall picture of what that may cost. And this is when we talk about how assessments, they help support a plan or guide a plan, but the assessment doesn't make the plan. This is what we're talking about, right? So this becomes kind of a hypothetical limit on the resources that a CMH would use to support the person. But it's not final yet because we haven't gone through the person-centered planning process. Then we get into pre-planning, which again, I talked about last time. It's not necessarily just that checklist that you get, but kind of everything that's going up to and through the actual meeting. So you have those assessed recommendations. The CMS would partner with the person to plan for a life that's meaningful for them. And the questions now are no longer about placement or the CMH's control over what to do with the person, but the discussion is centered around planning and supporting that person and where they want to go and what resources they think they need to get there. So by this time, they should kind of have an idea of the array of services they're eligible for and be able to make decisions on what they think would be best for them and their needs. So all of person-centered planning practice is about supporting that person to drive their own process. So this is kind of a continuous partnering, working with this person to make sure you're going towards somewhere meaningful where that person's dreams, desires, the things that are most important to them are foundational to their plan of service and what the CMH is supporting them to do. So the services and supports are there as a to support whatever that life dream is, right? So now those initial kind of service-centered recommendations where somebody has assessed their need and figured out kind of what we would offer, they get pared down to what that person decides is best for them. And we start to build up the framework for what will end up in that final plan. And then at this stage, we are kind of exploring what those self-directed options are. And the meetings, the different planning meetings will commence. A clear picture of the actual services that are agreed upon in the support of that person reaching their goals is determined. An overall estimated cost of services should be determined to help inform the person during that exploration process. So this is, getting into your, what a lot of people call their IPOS meeting, their person-centered planning meeting, and you're really determining out of all the assessed needs and the services that were recommended, which ones of those are actually going to pick, and out of those, which ones are going to be self-directed. So this might be a lengthy process and might include a significant period of learning to ensure that prior to entering into this SD arrangement, all of the people that are involved have a clear understanding of the different roles and responsibilities of all the parties under the arrangement, and making sure that this person has a clear understanding of all the applicable laws, required forms and agreements, Medicaid requirements for both staffing and documentation, their expectations for that documentation, payment processing, budgeting, the oversight and responsibility of that SD agreement overall. So remembering that this can be an overwhelming process for the person, and the role of that CMH in that is to provide that information, education, and support. This is where we can start talking about risk, right? So if you put up front to let people know that the CMH is there to provide that oversight, and they're watching for that fraud, waste, and abuse, and merely making sure that that person understands the responsibility, and they know that that's going to be watched for and will be, dealt with as it comes about. That's a good way to kind of prevent some of that risk that people worry about in a managed care setting. So by effectively educating and supporting people to enter these arrangements and making sure that they're aware of all the expectations, then they will be able to develop a successful arrangement. So next, we kind of determine, again, that spending plan. My slides are your slides going forward? Are you guys on estimating budget? What are you on?
I see estimating the budget amount.
Okay. Sorry. It does not look like they're going forward to me. So anyway, estimating the budget amount. That's the one I just did though. There. Okay. So now we're determining the spending plan. We have an idea of the total amount of the budget, like the lump sum, the whole dollar, right? That the person can use for their budget authority to decide how to use those funds. So we're having a process. We're engaging with the person and their chosen support. We discuss things like overhead, mileage, benefits, training costs, workman's comp, etc. And we want to make sure that any costs associated with the self-directed service must be included in that total budget amount. So you want to make sure that you go into specifics on how the cost can be estimated, and when you create the budget, and when you need to take those things into account at this point. So these, again, are some of the things that you want to make sure that you're talking about with people as they're deciding how to spend this money. So yes, if
Laura,
people go ahead.
I think that you may have missed that slide. There was a question
As far as-
about how are we, how are we getting to that budget amount? And I think that this speaks right to the whole which rate to use when you are helping someone create their budget, and how to use the estimated cost of service in that process as well.
I'm trying to figure out if I missed this slide. I don't think I missed this slide. Let me see. All right, so how to use that estimated cost is what you're asking?
Sorry, yeah, it jumped from creating the plan and helping people understand the options of self-directed services to what you're including in the budget, instead of, I think we kind of skipped over how to use the estimated cost of service, where that rate comes from, that whole process.
Okay. Oh, yes, right. See, I knew I wasn't making that up. I was like, I feel like we missed a slide. Okay, thank you, and I'm so sorry. At least I knew that I was missing a slide. I just couldn't figure out where it went. Okay, so yes, let's go back here. Okay, so, okay, now we have, I'm so sorry, this was out of control, out of order, but so when we estimate the budget, so at the end of our plan of service, right, we have an estimated cost of services. We take all of those things that we are authorizing in the plan, and we have an estimate of how much all of that is going to be, right? So whatever this person out of that decides to self-direct is going to be the foundation for their budget. So again, when the person is talking about the dollars are going to self-direct, we're talking about dollars. We do understand that we think of things in terms of units, services, authorizations, etc. So in the background, we are kind of adding up all those units, all those authorizations, and that's how we come up with that estimated cost. But we want to make sure that only those things that are going to be self-directed are included in that budget, because if people are using like that traditional impaneled provider, then they are using that, a straight traditional service. So that's how you distinguish between those two things. And once you have the estimated cost of services, you're using, again, those same provider rates as you would as if they were not going to self-direct. And so this is because, again, we want to make sure that we are having equity in our budget so that you have the same. And if you look at our cost allocation, we don't have anything at so-called SD rate. There is no such thing. So this does not mean that if you have a rate that you're setting in those OS as those provider rates when you're doing the estimate, it does not mean that that's what you're going to pay these direct hire people, for example, because when we talk about rate in these situations, it does not equate the same way as, if you are paying a provider, typically your rate is going to be what the CMH is paying out. We are just using those to kind of estimate the dollars and figure out the top of the budget limit. So the limit is what's going to be given to the FMS for that person to be able to then use the dollars in the way they see fit to create that spending plan and then develop a wage for their workers. So again, when we talk about the highest provider rate, we're talking about a limit, not a wage. Different. So the total of all the services that your person chooses self-direct is the basis for that budget. And yes, there can be different service rates using this process, and we can have all kinds of different services that are self-directed, CLS, support brokers, supported employment, therapy, etc. is going to make up the whole budget.
So I want to jump in here, and there seems to be some confusion about what we're saying when we say the estimated cost of service. So I just want to clarify that the estimated cost of service is a typical report that everyone should be receiving annually. And that is, again, an estimated cost of if you use all of the services authorized in your plan, regardless of whether or not you're utilizing a self-directed arrangement, any service in your plan, and that cost is tied to the provider rate for that service, CLS, supported employment, therapy, support coordination, whatever. And the intent of that report is to help people make informed choices about how those funds that are authorized on their behalf are being used. So if they're seeing an amount for therapy, for example, that is $30,000 a year, and they're thinking like, oh, I don't really think that that's a good value for my services, that helps them make an informed choice of maybe I want to use those funds a little differently. Maybe I want to allocate that money to something that I would find more meaningful. So that's the report that we're talking about when we say the estimated cost of services.
Typically, there'll be a dollar amount right in the plan of
Yes.
service. So if for some reason your CMH or PHP is not doing that, if it's not in the plan, usually it's in the plan, but there's usually somewhere that you can find it. And some places do actually like an estimate, what is it called? An EOB,
Yeah, an
explanation of benefits.
Yeah. Yep.
Which is kind of the similar scenario. But this is kind of the numbers and the reason that you need to be able to tell somebody what that is so that they have a clear picture of kind of what they have to work with, like Marie was saying. Plus, it helps you know what you have to work with and what kind of your parameters are for that budget. So,
and that is important. I mean, even outside of the self-directed arrangement, that's something that we look for in site review is, do you know what your estimated cost of services are? And do you know how to move those funds or how to use them differently should you want to? So that's something that's actually looked for in the site review process, and is important that that conversation is happening during the planning process with everyone receiving services. And that gets back to the bigger idea of self-determination.
absolutely. Any other questions?
Not right now. Why don't you go on and I'll look.
Okay. And again, I'm sorry about jumping screens. I don't know what happened, but so again, the discussion when you're talking about how to spend this, how the person is going to spend these dollars. A lot of this discussion hopefully has happened earlier in the process through pre-planning, etc. But you want to make sure that this is done with the person that you're really kind of looking at, like, do you want to be able to pay people mileage? Do you want them to have any benefits? Do you want any more training? What is your rate of pay going to be for people? Are there any other benefits you want to have? Are we going to make sure that there's room when you set wages for somebody to have a raise or not? Do you want to be able to have a way to retain your staff and make sure that people that do a really good job can be rewarded for that? And helping people understand that the way they use those dollars, while it's in their control, they're just like if you were going to start your own business for some reason, you would only have the amount of money that you have to work with. So you might want to pay them oodles and oodles of money and do all kinds of nice things, but you only have a limited amount of resources. So how are you going to kind of parse that out and make sure that it makes that whatever that lump sum of money is going to make it through that whole year? So this is kind of the key to making budget authority happen in a real way. And anyone that chooses to self-direct or use choice voucher has budget authority as part of our waivers. So the whole point of it is for people to be able to purchase what is valuable to them and what in their ideal scenario would help them best achieve the goals in their IPOS. So what this means for the CMH is that people need to be supported to have real, meaningful, person-centered plans and person-centered planning throughout the time that they're in services. Otherwise, the person's self-determination is not upheld, and the very principle of self-directed services is not really achievable. So please make sure that you're doing really good person-centered planning throughout this process. They all go together. kind of paranoid my slides are not going forward now. Let me know. The person has now outlined what models of self-directed services they want to use, what services they're going to self-direct, the types of things they want covered in their budget, and decided on kind of those line items that are going to be included in their budget. Now they should have a decent sense of how they can use the resources provided in a flexible, person-driven way. So they're determining that spending plan and understand their responsibilities in using their funds in a responsible way, balanced throughout the year, that's not excessive in cost, and in line with the goals of their plan. So the FMS is going to step in with those budget reports every month, and they need to go to all the different parties, the person, the CMH, and the FMS will partner together in the oversight of making sure that a person stays within budget throughout the year. So then we get to the final stage where we're really finalizing that budget. And this is determined by, again, you start by assessing the person's needs. You have kind of this open-ended process, doing your biopsychosocial, et cetera. You're figuring out, what this person's eligible for and what we think we would recommend. Then you kind of come up with that estimated cost based on those traditional service rates and in line with other providers of that same service. And once they know that budget amount, they determine their spending plan and then how they're going to implement that. And the budget is only limited to be the same or less than whatever the services would cost without self-directing. So you're never going to ever cost more than you would if the person had chosen not to self-direct. So this is
before you move on, Laura, we're getting questions on who develops the spending plan. Is that the FMS? Is that the CMH who helps walk that person through it? And I just want to say that it varies depending on where you are. It can be the FMS. It can be a well-informed self-determination coordinator at your CMH. But like Laura said, I think that the key to that process is that you are working through that with a person, whether it's your FMS or it's you as the CMH. We often will see, especially like during site reviews, we talk about this process for people who have self-directed arrangements. And rarely do we hear families who have a story of actually sitting down and helping create their spending plan based on what their budget is and that they're well informed on everything that could potentially be included in the budget, how they want to control those dollars. So that's the biggest key, is that you're walking with the person utilizing the service to help create that plan. And if you are having your FMS do it, then you need to make sure that that is the process, that they're not just saying, oh, here you go, here's your rate, or here's what is going to be included in your budget.
Thank you, Marie. So in this sample budget, we have, you can see that, at the bottom, it kind of looks similar to maybe an authorization. You've got whatever the service is, the units, what the rate is, and then calculated out what that projected cost is going to be. Michigan has what we call retrospective budgeting. So the idea is that you plan for what is going to be used, but we look at it in a behind the scenes manner so that you can adjust things and move things as needed. So this, in the top of this budget, you can see that the budget's including some paid time off, training, there's a health and wellness class in there, and there's purchase of service agreements. So all of that is rolled into there, and you'll note that here we have a range for how much a person would be able to hire their directly hired employees. And then down here, if you do the math, you can see that that cost is actually more than what the top rate of that range is for that hour. And that's because we are doing a base wage based on, that provider rate and employee related costs, and that's allocated in the budget as a whole. So where your typical traditional service, your rate is your rate, and that's it. There are things that need to be calculated in the budget to be able to cover what the person wanted to be able to spend their dollars on. So we get into the next steps. So
But
our
can we,
plan,
sorry,
go ahead.
before we go on, we're getting some questions about, and we will be doing more like technical on the budget and the budget creation. But if you go back to that previous slide, there were questions
Sure.
about how things and where are they included, and is this included in this piece? Typically this, and this is just an example. This is the budget that I used to use, and it's just an overall snapshot of everything that's included in this budget. There are other, I'm going to say tabs because this is an Excel, that are used to calculate everything that you're seeing reflected here. So things like the cost of the wellness class are all in the training, and all of the PTO are all calculated on a separate tab that all then becomes part of that unit rate for whatever service we're attaching it to. There was also a question about, well, what code would you code the wellness class? You're not coding the wellness class because that's not a service. So it's part of that CLS service. It's helping meet that goal. So we're tying it all together through the plan of the medical necessity. And so you're rolling in the cost of that, and it's being coded under CLS. So it's just all included in that rate. I'm going to say if that helps and then let you move on in case we get more questions.
And we'll do more, so
Yes.
don't worry. So now we've got the plan authorized. Now we're going to start going into those agreements. The person will sign along with the CMH and their employees if they hire some. Many agreements that we're going to go into, make job descriptions, do that employer training we talked about, and then they can start trying to recruit their workers. After all that we go into implementation. So people, now the arrangement is starting. They're getting their employees hired, trained, and starting that arrangement. And then we have the ongoing monitoring, making sure that people are staying within their budget. Some employer record, the fiscal management service provider, CMH are all working together to oversee the arrangement and proactively attending to things that arise. So CMH is always in charge of oversight. They're always looking for fraud, waste, and abuse across the board for Medicaid. We should always be looking for things and getting to them before they become a huge problem. And that, again, is part of the prevention that we'll go into later. So these are the list of agreements that you need to deal with in all of these arrangements. We have the self-directed services agreement, the financial management services agreement, the employment agreement, purchase of service agreement, Medicaid provider agreement, and the agency supported self-directed services agreement. So the self-directed services agreement really describes the responsibilities of the CMH and PIHP, including the ways that they can support the person. They describe the authority and responsibilities of the individual, how the agreement, the plan of service, or the budget can be changed, I should say, and or the budget can be changed, and describe the FMS arrangements. The FMS agreement is between the FMS and describes their duties, the duties of the PIHP, CMH, the role.
Before we skip
Go ahead.
over the self-directed service agreement, I just want to point out that this is a crucial agreement to the effectiveness of these arrangements. It not only is it what lays out very clearly, and it should be very clear, and easy to understand in as much plain language as possible, everyone's roles and responsibilities. But if there are any limitations to the arrangement, we talk in the guidance and in other trainings that we've done about how you can set some limits within these arrangements when it comes to maybe total control. If there have been instances of like potential misuse or not spectacular control over the arrangement. So having those agreements really, really, really clear and specific are key, because that not only is what you as a CMH can fall back on if you do need to look to potentially end an arrangement, but it's what the person can also fall back on.
Yes. Yeah, and these are, I tried to call them contracts once upon a time, but people didn't like them being called contracts, but they are really, they're laying out the roles and responsibilities of what people agree to do and what, and you know, that self-directed arrangement agreement is really about the parameters, and that person should have some control over, you know, the particulars of how that's going to be laid out. So again, all of those things will be kind of negotiated and worked out together. And then once you're kind of in agreement with that, then you're, both parties are signing, and that really drives how the arrangement goes forward. So again, the FMS agreement is again describing those duties of the FMS service and how the method for how that CMH would like the FMS to approve timesheets. This is another area that the CMH can use to kind of help define what the role and the things that they want the FMS to do. So some places want the FMS to make sure they track training, they do background checks. Some of them have asked to hold the documentation from everything, which we would prefer that not be their role, but holding is okay, but reviewing and checking over is not okay. So we've put that in the guidance as well. It is not the FMS's job to provide clinical support. They're clearly just a fiscal agency. The employment agreement is between the person and the provider. So that describes the nature of the services, the employment relationship, the structure of service authorization and payment methods, all of their compensation and benefits, the rules and regs of that person's employment, the importance of that Medicaid provider agreement, which is also going to be signed, and the requirements that the employee must meet. And these are all they all have templates in the back of the guidance, so that you, as a CMH, you can adjust them to whatever needs to be put in for each individual. So if somebody is doing a purchase of a service agreement, this agreement would then describe the duties of that service provider, again, their compensation and benefits, the rules and regs, and again, the importance of that Medicaid provider agreement. The Medicaid provider agreement is kind of universal. Again, defines the roles and responsibilities of the parties that are in that agreement and ensure that compliance with federal Medicaid requirements. And then if the person is using the agency supported self-directed services, they would sign this agreement. And this again would be tailored to exactly how the agency is going to support this person in self-directing their services. So while they're the provider agency and might follow a lot of those CMH rules for training, for example, because they might be impaneled, they could be impaneled in this situation, then the person could have some control over whatever that agency is willing to allow them to do, up to, you know, they could technically do their wages. No, I don't think anybody's doing that at this point in time, but, you know, at least have that control of the person being able to hire who they want out of the agency, who's walking through their door, when they're coming, some of those basic things that give a person more control over just hiring an agency and the agency just sending whoever out to do that service. So in each of these service arrangements, so the direct employment or direct hire, you would do the self-directed services agreement, the FMS agreement, the employment agreement, and the Medicaid provider agreement. In those agency supported self-directed arrangements, you would do the self-directed services agreement, the employment agreement, purchase of service agreement. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not even reading my chart right. The self-directed services agreement, the Medicaid provider agreement, and the agency supported self-directed agreement. And then a purchase of service would be the self-directed services agreement, the FMS agreement, the purchase of service agreement, and the Medicaid provider agreement. And the reason this NA under the agency supported is orange is because typically you would not have a FMS agreement, but you could hire an agency through a purchase of service agreement, and then you would want to have an FMS agreement. So, and these are outlined in the guide as well. And it has more of the different parties that need to sign each agreement. But this is kind of an overview of all of those things. So there's a lot of paperwork up front, but getting things up and running after those things are done, there's work up front, but then as things go on, it's a little bit less intense. So any questions for me, Marie?
We have a lot, and I'm trying to get to them in the chat as much as I can. There's a theme right now about are you saying it's okay to not pay an employee if X happened or Y happened? And that seems to have varied in what that example is, but in general, like, I cannot stress enough, no, that is not acceptable not to pay an employee for time legally worked. According to Department of Labor standards and expectations, staff paid and approved payment by their employer must be paid according to the set pay schedule. We did have a question, and we're getting a little bit more into the weeds right now than I want to with these questions, but we're getting them, so I think we should answer them. About if there was a discrepancy in a timesheet, maybe an overlapping time or something like that. And yes, those times, if you cannot fix that or get an answer to that discrepancy by the time the payroll, after making effort though, is going out, you can withhold, the FMS can withhold payment, but only for that exact, say it's 15 minutes that you're overlapping. Those 15 minutes can be withheld until the next pay period, but it has to be, I think I used the word addressed in the chat, but you have to make an effort to correct whatever the question is so that those hours do get paid. So I'm going to let you keep going for now.
Okay. So now we're getting into budget and budget authority. So these are some of the things from CMS language, from federal language. When you have budget authority, the individual budget gives the latitude to use this budget to purchase individually selected goods and services, including but not limited to employing workers. So budget authority and employer authority come kind of hand in hand. It also says the Medicaid beneficiary may hire their own provider, train the provider according to their personal preferences, supervise and direct the provision of personal care services, and if necessary, fire the provider. The CMS guidance also states to permit family members or other participants to direct the provider on behalf of the individual receiving services. So it's okay for a person to use a representative to help with some of the managing duties in these situations. So really a hallmark of self-direction is assuring the person has the opportunity to direct a fixed amount of resources as identified in the individual budget, which is derived from the person-centered planning process. The person independently or with assistance from allies controls the use of resources in his or her individual budget to determine which services and supports he or she will purchase, from whom, and under what circumstances. So it doesn't mean that they have to stick with the kind of in-network providers or the people on the panel, but that they can choose where they're going to get those services and supports from. So through this process, the person possesses the power to make meaningful choices in how they live their lives. So again, we talked about earlier, in a traditional service model, when we talk about a rate, we're generally talking about how much the CMH is paying a provider. But in this model, we're talking about rate, we're talking about dollars that are used to set the budget. And then from that, you deduce a wage. So again, traditionally, we think those things are equal, but in this scenario, they're not equal. Any questions, Marie? You don't
Yes.
have to have questions.
I do want to, I have seen a couple of people say I can't see the Q&A, and that's correct. The Q&A, we turn the Q&A off, it goes to the chat. So we as panelists and moderators can see that, but we do take down everything that we get, and we are working on developing an ongoing frequently asked question so that we will put that on the website so that everybody can see questions and answers after this is finished. And there have been some questions that I know we're going to touch on the flexibility and how that relates to medical necessity and moving dollars around. If medical necessity says that I'm going to use a horrible word, qualify for 10 hours of CLS, how could you possibly move those dollars somewhere else? So I know we're going to get into that, but I just want to throw that out there.
Okay. So again, this is kind of an overview of the budget that we went through in detail before, but I think because we got out of order, it's probably good that we have it again. So again, we're trying to find the parameters of the budget. So you begin with that allowable contracted provider rate, deduct the benefits from that rate, which again, this is the rates of all the different services together totaled up, right? And you get that estimated cost of services. It forms the parameters of the budget. The person ends up setting the wage out of that lump sum dollar, the whole dollars. The CMH does not set the wage. Each line item is associated to a service, right? And each of those services is where the cost for all the things in the budget come out of. So if someone has a goal to, I don't know, do better at work, and they have something that cost relates to, employment somehow, then that's kind of the line out of the budget that you would charge for that, whatever that thing is. And then you can kind of in the HAB waiver, in the children's waiver, if you have similar services like CLS and respite, and you want to switch some of those hours around, that's fine. Work with the FMS to do that. And then you calculate those line items, number of units times the cost per unit. Again, good overview.
We're getting there. So I just wanted to say that we are going to address the whole, if the FMS cost needs to come out of the service budget amount. The answer is no.
Right. Okay.
So we're here.
So an FMS is a covered Medicaid service. So yes, technically it is part of the budget, but it should not be reducing that amount of dollars that you're allowing the person to use to pay for services. And we also don't want administrative costs coming out of that budget. So we're not reducing the amount of money that people have in their budget by either of these things. So now we're kind of going into like what each party can control. So the person or the family in a choice voucher arrangement would control how much of the budget is used during a certain amount of time. So we have hopefully OSS that are as long as possible, maybe that whole person-centered planning year. so that a person or a family member can say, you know what, we're going to go on vacation, so we're not going to use any hours this month, but next month we might need more. Whatever the gamut is, because people's lives change, things happen. Sometimes people need something a little bit more or a little bit less. Maybe they always use the exact same amount the whole year. That's fine. But you're kind of talking about assessing an overall need and not letting people flex inside that need. So they also get to determine when and how frequently wages are changed. So if they decide in the middle of the year that, you know, their worker Sally is doing a great job and they want to reward Sally, they would work with them at FMS to make sure that they have money in the budget to be able to award that raise. They would determine the employee benefits, whatever they may be, when overtime is approved, and hopefully that's pre-planned, because overtime can get costly and surprising. But you know, if something needs to happen, they would work with the FMS and CMH to say, for whatever reason, I'm going to need some overtime, and get that approved so that they can budget that in. And then again, that being able to move dollars from one item, one service to another when needed in those specific waivers. So the CMH would be able to control, we require workman's comp. So again, the FMS is in charge of making sure that that workman's comp get paid. Like to think of it like if you have a mortgage and you have escrow, they're kind of putting those dollars aside for whenever that premium is due, and they figure that out. The CMH will establish the maximum amount of funds that can be used in that budget. They have oversight for that budget, making sure that people are staying on track. They're really in charge of trying to make sure that if a person is kind of getting off track with their budget, and the FMS should be alerting everyone to that fact, that they're stepping in ahead of time before it gets out of control and people are completely out of money. So that shouldn't be happening, that we should be preventing that. We want to make sure that the budget is authorized for the same time frame as the plan of service. So in the past, a lot of people have had fiscal year budgets that don't match the plan of service. And the problem with that is that the person can't really control the use of the budget when it's getting authorized for a different period of time than the plan of service. So we want those to be the same. And the CMH can also establish a training rate. And this is specific to those trainings that are the employer has chosen, like above and beyond what we need for staff qualifications. And then the person and family is responsible for using those funds to meet the needs identified in the plan of service. So they're not supposed to be just paying for things willy-nilly. It has to reflect whatever they identified in the plan. So something needs to meet whatever goals that they have in their IPOS. They need to stay within their authorized amounts. They need to make sure that they're not exceeding whatever those authorized amounts are. Again, reviewing that budget monthly that the FMS is providing, making sure that they're staying within their budget, informing the CMH of any needed changes to that budget, and then ensuring all the documentation is there and accessible for any time the CMH may need it for an audit, etc., claims, etc.
So before we move on, we are getting a lot of questions about moving funds and maybe not using as many funds in one budget line covering another budget line. Do you want those individually, or do you want to just talk in general about that?
I guess I'd like something more specific if possible.
Okay. So here's one. If dollars are moved from one line item to another, does that mean that CLS units, for example, can be moved to cover more OT units?
Well, that's not, when we talk about similar services, we're talking about kind of like I had said, like respite and CLS, maybe supported employment, CLS, you know, so we want, because an OT would be a professional level service. So if you wanted to take like a service that would typically be OT, again, like that service is supporting a certain IPOS goal. So is there something that the person would spend the dollars that would go to that occupational therapist on something similar? So I don't know, maybe somebody's dexterity in their hands is bad, and instead of spending it on an OT, they're gonna, I don't know, buy some kind of hand exerciser or something. You know, so you want it to have the similarity to whatever that IPS goal is, IPOS goal is, and those, if you're going to change between those service lines, they need to be for similar things. And again, that's because you want it to be in kind of that same goal area. And respite and CLS tend to get paired together because a lot of times you're able to kind of, if you have a caregiver who needs a break, you're kind of doing that same, you're not doing the same level of teaching, training, et cetera, but you're doing the supervision, assisting, all of that other stuff. So some of those things are covered in both. Does that help? I hope.
I'm gonna say for now.
For now, okay. I promise you will not get in trouble as long as you're under those waivers. So,
Well, and I think we always need to remember the medical necessity piece of it when it comes to using services. So I think that that's important.
I think that generally, you know, once you have your plan done, once you have your budget, you're kind of unlocking people from that strict, like, you know, we put this service under this line and it has this many units and it has to have these many claims and all of that, so that you, the person, can be a lot more flexible. Again, that's why we talk about it in dollars instead of units and authorizations, because you're literally allowing the person to, you know, just like if you or I needed something done around our house or whatever, we would take money out of our budget, right, and pay someone to mow the lawn or whatever, but we don't have to go ask somebody if it's okay to take it out of this certain service code. So it's really kind of breaking it away. On the back end, yes, the reality is that we have those authorizations and claims that need to be done to pay for it, but that's not what the person, how they're looking at being able to have control over how those dollars are spent. It'll take a while, but you'll get it. I promise.
Well, and I do want to just like take this moment because we're getting more questions than I apologize that I'm able to respond to in real time right now about the budget. And we are aware that this is an ongoing and very, very complicated part of these arrangements. And when it comes to this flexibility and how does it tie into medical necessity, especially how does it tie into what we're being audited on, and you know, what the auditors say about ranges and things like that. So please be aware that we know that, and we are working to continue to develop more precise and specific TA when it comes to these issues.
Okay. So again, in our various roles, the main job of the CMH in this role is to provide support to this arrangement. We want to make sure that the person has enough information and assistance that they are able to confidently go forward with this arrangement. Information and assistance, typically we talk about in our waivers, is covered by your supports coordinator or case manager. But we are all aware of the realities of all of the things that we expect a supports coordinator or case manager to do as it is. And so another way that CMS talks about information and assistance is a support broker or a counselor. And since support brokers are already a paid for service, you could utilize a support broker in this role. And we'll get into that more in the FAQs, but that's what this is the information assistance to kind of support the person in their arrangement, making sure they understand all their responsibilities. We want to make sure that the employer of record understands the provider qualifications, so they know when their staff is able to provide that service. Again, that CMH's main job is that oversight, as it is with every service, to make sure that those Medicaid standards are met. We want prevention to avoid any major problems, and then provide any necessary credentialing in any of those purchase of service agreements, for example. The FMS role, they do the payroll and the HR functions. They're sending those monthly budget statements. They are paying and reimbursing invoices and timesheets, and they support the employer with any of the employer functions. If they are having trouble with the timesheet, or some of them are using an EVV system already, all of that good stuff. And then the employer of record, again, they're the ones who are going to review and authorize those timesheets with a signature, or if they are on an electronic device, as long as there's something that it's clear that that person is authorizing those timesheets, that's what kind of submits them for payment. So just like all of us have somebody that signs off on our timesheets for it to go through to payroll, it's the same kind of scenario. They will develop a job description for the people that they hire, set their schedules, ensure those services are actually being rendered, stay within their budget, and then supervise their employees, ensure they're following those Medicaid rules, and that their providers remain eligible. So Marie was talking earlier about some of the calculations that are done in the budget. A big one is setting those wages. So again, when you kind of get that overall recommendations for the needs, the CMH will provide that overall cost to the FMS provider with whatever the rate the person would have gotten had they been supported in a traditional service arrangement. So again, when we talk about the provider rate, we would give that rate to the FMS, let them know how many units the person's authorized for. Then you can calculate out whatever the maximum would be. So I just threw in random unit rates and how many units, came up with a total dollar amount for this made up wage range. So this person would have $56,240 in their budget. And then based on that total amount, the FMS would work with the CMH, the person, they would back out all the taxes, the workman's comp, mileage, et cetera, and then be able to work out how much the range is that the person would be able to pay their employees. And then this would be kind of a calculator to figure out, after you back out all those costs, what you have left. So in this example, you can see at the bottom that the FMS has figured out the max pay rate is $12.31 an hour. This is probably an old calculation because now we have, for at least for CLS and some of these essential workers, we have the premium pay. So hopefully people have a little more maximum than this, but the employer of record should now know the range of what they can employ their employees. You want the bottom to be minimum wage plus whatever employee related expenses there would be, because Department of Labor will want you to make sure that you're covering those employee related expenses up to whatever that max pay rate. And this pay rate is going to vary determined on and be determined by, you know, what benefits the person wants. So as you can see, there's mileage in there. Maybe that you have vacation days or holidays. paid time off, whatever kind of things that the employer of record wants to be have this person compensated for would be included. So it's going to change what the hourly rate would be based on those things. So the initial rate to set the budget has to be, again, equitable to that provider rate so that the employer of record would have enough room in the budget to be able to pay for some of these other benefits. Any questions?
So, yeah, sorry. Before we go on to this piece, we had some questions earlier about, is there a, all-encompassing list of the types of benefits somebody can include in a budget? And I guess I would say they're not all-encompassing, but we have, some general ideas of what people include. I mean, everything up to health insurance. People who use a lot of OT will often include the cost of that known OT in their budget, training costs, workers' comp. And a lot of your FMS providers have really simple, basic, easy to use budget calculators that really make this process very simple. It sounds overwhelming and like it's a lot, but it really can be very, very simple to do. But we can put together maybe a guide, because there's not going to be a be all end all list for folks of what that could be, but you do need to be informed enough to be able to have that educated conversation with the person as they're building their spending plan. And we've also, one of the FAQs that we've received a lot is about the cost of workman's comp and how you calculate that, and do you need to include it? And the answer is obviously yes, like you absolutely do. And your FMS helps calculate that based on like FTE or PTEs after the fact. So, but there's kind of an established known for those ones. We also had a question before we keep moving related to authorizations and people having internal authorizations that only go for a month instead of a whole year. And we address this pretty clearly in the guidance that your internal systems cannot be a barrier to budget control and authority, and having an internal authorization system that only approves every month is a barrier to budget control. And our recommendation would be that needs to be changed. The budget needs to be authorized for the same amount as the plan.
The other thing that where those monthly authorizations were very common was in the children's waiver and SED waiver, because they were fee for service at one point in time. And so we wanted to make sure that those costs were very much contained because you didn't want to go over your estimated budget that you put forth to the state for those waivers. But now there is no fee for service anymore. It's a capitation payment. So there is no reason that you have to limit those authorizations at this point in time. And you should be able to feel more secure and having that flexibility, because you do have that capitation payment that's kind of moving across the whole spectrum of people that are on those waivers. And as people use less or more of that based on their needs, that cost will be covered. So anything else?
No, I mean, we are still getting some questions, and I will just again say, like, we are working on more specific budget TA, but about like, well, how do you pay for a benefit? It's not a face-to-face service for CLS and things like that. And like, I want to reiterate that the rate for your CLS has to be all encompassing of everything, including your benefits, your training hours, your pay rates, your workers' comp, your FICAs, your FUCAs, your everything that is included in that service delivery. So if that is, say, a wellness class, but also any of those overheads or benefits or paid time off, all are part of that rate. So they're all billed under that CLS or whatever the service is.
And if you go into, our PIHP CMH encounter data, long grid, I guess, that we have, and you look up, CLS, for example, and what is included in the cost of that service, it says training and transportation and for group homes, they'll have cost of vehicles and the whole thing. All of that overhead and those things are already covered in that service. So just like a provider might pay time off or sick leave or health insurance, you can also do the same thing here. It is part of that service, it's covered. And that again is why we pay an equitable provider rate in these budgets, so that people have the flexibility to do those things. So,
Yeah. And
so
one
now,
more before
go
we
ahead.
go on is about oversight. And I know that we've talked about oversight, and but I cannot stress enough, from all different perspectives, the person, the CMH, the FMS, everybody involved in these arrangements, that this really is a partnership. When it comes to making sure that these are successful and that they follow all the rules and that we're mitigating risk and things like that. And when it comes to like concerns related to overtime, I know that the clarification that you can't just arbitrarily say, no, you can't work overtime for someone's employees, or no, we're not going to pay overtime. Like, right, that's a violation of labor law. So you can't say that, but you do have to work together to monitor the use of overtime and help to make sure that we're educating people on what impact that's going to have on their budget. You know,
Right.
you can't just expect your FMS to do all the heavy lifting when it comes to that piece of it. So all three of those entities are really trying to do as much monitoring and support, working together as a team, to make sure that we're catching things. You know, we should never get 6 months down the road and be stunned that somebody has used a significant amount of overtime or is overutilizing the expected amount by 50% or something like that, if we're all working together proactively to monitor these.
Right.
So now we can go on.
Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about value. So our old self-D policy talked about this quote. It says, arrangements for services shall not be excessive in cost. Individuals should aim for securing a better value in terms of the outcomes for the costs involved. And I believe that this phrase has been misinterpreted by people. You know, Medicaid is always, a scarce resource, and we're trying to contain those dollars as much as possible and use them as wisely as possible. And so this value has been seen almost like a value for Medicaid. But this value, this term here, is talking about the value to the individual. So basically, what does the person value in terms of coming to the outcomes that they would like? In other words, how do they get to a point where they can achieve the goals of their plan in a way that is valuable to them? So just make sure that when we talk about these things, that we're really, again, because this is all about this person having the choice and control about how they're spending these dollars, it's because we want to help them achieve a value by their definition. And this is kind of how we have shown that self-directed services work, because people are really able to focus on the things they want to do. They don't have to do the things they don't want to do and they don't value. They can choose the people and professionals that they want, and they can use that budget creatively. And none of these things have to do with market competition or driving prices down or creating, it's all about creating more options for people, right? So what is most important about all this is the ability to use all those resources flexibly and creatively. And I know this is very different than a traditional model. So it's hard to wrap your mind around, but it's all about really supporting that person to be able to use those dollars in a way that enhances their own value. So again, not Medicaid value, not the CMH's value, the person's value. Any questions?
No, not
Okay.
right now.
All right. So now we're getting into like that ongoing employee training. So we've got people, they're qualified providers, they've done their initial trainings in good standing with the law, able to communicate and expressively and receptively and follow the plan of service, et cetera, et cetera. So now we want to make sure that that ongoing training is occurring so that people stay qualified providers. So if we've done our initial credentialing and that person has been deemed qualified provider, they've done their bloodborne pathogens training that makes them able to prevent the transmission of communicable diseases, that is done. As long as they're employed for this person, they don't have to take that training again. If we have somebody working under a choice voucher, the emergency procedures that they talk about in the SED and the children's waiver is kind of that fire safety, tornadoes, et cetera, which a lot of places called emergency preparedness versus emergency procedures. I like to call it preparedness because it differentiates from beneficiary specific emergency procedures, which are required for everybody, because that's part of your plan of service. Those emergency procedures are specific to the individual. So you might have a seizure protocol or what to do if somebody elopes or a myriad of things, again, that are beneficiary specific. And that's done annually with that IPOS training. And so, or as that plan is amended, then your basic first aid is supposed to be done every 2 years. Again, just basic first aid. You don't have to have the American Red Cross certification. If you do, that's fine, but it's not required. And then your recipient rights every year. And these things will keep that provider qualified. So if a person is within these timelines, they're fine to continue providing services. Excuse me. Some PIHPs might have made other timelines for this, but we just want to make sure that people are qualified to provide those services. So the employer of record should be working with their FMS to make sure that people are staying up to date with their training, and then really be proactive about making sure that people are going to meet their deadlines. If something happens and something slips through the cracks, can we do an online training or rapid training or something that helps people kind of stay in their jobs? We already have a major crisis for a lot of these staff trying to keep people employed. So we don't want to create more barriers to people being able to stay in their job. If something happens and somebody misses a paycheck or something, and that, ruins this person's ability to work, or they quit because something happened. We don't want that, especially in this environment. So again, being proactive, preventing situations from happening to begin with is the key. Again, that oversight and making sure that things are on track and dealing with problems before they get big.
We do have questions related to the training that have come throughout. And so while I think that there's understanding of being proactive and trying to get ahead before issues happen, like what is the threshold, or is there a threshold for when are you no longer considered a trained Medicaid provider who can be paid due to delinquent trainings?
Right at the moment, because of the public health emergency, we actually have a relaxed, for a lot of the trainings, you still need your IPOS training, but a lot of those trainings it was, like that day, whatever day that was overdue, then that person was no longer considered qualified. But because of the public health emergency, you can show good faith effort that you're trying to get this person into compliance. And again, if we can figure out if next month this person's training is going to expire and things still aren't happening, working with that employer record to basically say, like, I need you to get this training in because I don't want you to lose any of your work, etc. And being able to kind of have those things ahead of time. I think that's why a lot of PHPs have people do a lot of these trainings every year, even though they're only due maybe every 2 years. That way everybody's always in compliance and they're always meeting those standards.
I think it's important to point out that, you know, a lot of FMS providers have great ways to track training and, again, are your partner in that process. There are some questions about the per employment episode. So if I have a bloodborne pathogens that's required once per employment episode, and I work with John Doe and I work with Susie 3 months later, do I have to have that training again for each employer?
We have reciprocity agreements across the CMHs. So there's no reason that you can't. The big thing is, you know, when it comes down to audits and you're trying to present that material, as long as, you know, for John Doe or Sally, you know, that you have that proof to show that that person was trained within that amount of time. So because of that reciprocity, you can still use that bloodborne pathogen training, but you want to make sure for, you know, for first aid, for example, that does kind of expire, that, you know, it's within that window. I think what the per employment episode is really trying to target is, you know, those people that if they worked, you know, in 1985 or whatever, quit and then came back 10 years later or whatever, they should probably have a refresher. But for the most part, if you're kind of a ongoing provider and you've maybe switched from place to place, again, because we have that reciprocity, even if you had worked in a different county, as long as that reciprocity holds across whatever county line and your PHP is agreeing to that, that's a legitimate training, and there's standards for how that training has to be given to meet that reciprocity. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about that, you can email me. But they had a statewide training group that worked really hard on making sure that those trainings had to meet a certain criteria to have that reciprocity. So just make sure that those standards are met and you should be okay.
Yeah, there certainly are a lot of questions coming in about this topic specifically. And some of those, if we don't get to them right now, just email us. But I think there is still some confusion about the reciprocity because of the different employers. So each person is their own employer. And is that covered under that?
So moving on to communication. So as part of all the lovely agreements that we've signed earlier, part of those agreements, you have to dedicate a liaison at both the fiscal management service provider and at the CMH level. So that's going to be the person that is communicated with between those entities. So the FMS must notify CMH and the employer when the payroll, if the payroll is late, any issues with the arrangement that arise, if there's an issue with the timesheet, over reporting, a late submission, or questions of fraud and abuse, then we want to make sure that those things are communicated. And then the employer of record must notify the fiscal management agency, financial management service agency, and the CMH when there's an unexpected need for overtime, they're hiring or dismissing workers, or there's any kind of change needed in the budget. Communication in general is always good when we make sure that the support coordinator, case managers meeting at a regular interval to make sure that everything is going well and that oversight is provided as well. So that's part of that CMH part. But So then we get into joint employment rules. So I think a lot of people have had joint employment rules scare them off from really providing some of that support to people. So really, when you're talking about joint employment, we're talking about these 4 things. So if you have a CMH that is controlling what the employer's employee is getting paid, that's joint employment. If the CMH is controlling who the person is hiring and firing, that is joint employment. If they're controlling what trainings the workers get, that's joint employment. The state would set the trainings of what makes a provider qualified, not the CMH. If the CMH is controlling worker performance, like setting schedules or managing how the worker is working, that is joint employment. So those are really the key things that you want to avoid. Notice that they all say control. So if you're not controlling these things, then you generally do not have to worry about joint employment. So in order to avoid this, like, you do not make hiring and firing decisions. CMH does not require employees to be placed on a provider panel. They do not supervise the employees, set schedules, deny payroll for work that has been completed and approved by the employer, set more restrictive qualifications for employees than the state minimum, determine their pay rates or benefits, or refuse overtime approved by the employer. And that doesn't mean that you can't support the person in being an employer or managing their arrangement. So in order to make sure that our arrangements are successful, that employer of record must be really, really well trained, again, in those provider qualifications and how to apply that Medicaid exclusion list. They need to know the parameters on the wages in their budget, so that range from the minimum wage to the top, the allocation of their budget and their plan to use the budget, those basic labor laws. So even something like, besides joint employer rules, you would probably want them to know you can't put an ad out that says, I need a muscular man to hire to work for my disabled son or whatever. Like, you can't have discriminatory phrases in advertisement, for example. So those are the kinds of things that they would need to know to be able to successfully do this arrangement. And again, that fraud, waste, and abuse are unacceptable and will be investigated. Any questions?
We don't have questions on that, but I do want to just add that at the 2020 SD conference, we did a pretty detailed presentation on the FLSA requirements when it comes to joint employment. There are also great handbooks and cheat guides out there that we can actually put on the website too, that will help folks through these questions of joint co-employment.
Okay. And now the fun part. So this is the beginning of our FAQs. The first one is, please clarify if independent supports brokers and independent support coordinators would be viewed as having 2 different roles and responsibilities. Yes, support brokers and support coordinators should have separately defined roles. These services cannot duplicate each other, and currently, support coordinators and targeted case managers have been responsible for the potential duties of the information assistance that a supports broker can help with. Support brokers can be hired independently or through the CMH. So more on support brokers. Support broker is already a covered service. CMS has this line: if there is no support broker or agent required or chosen by the person, then that person must have training in acting as his or her own support broker. And that's from the Affordable Care Act. So this is a list, and I apologize, it's tiny, but I couldn't fit it on here otherwise. So on the left, we have things a typical support coordinator or support coordinator assistant might be doing. So these are typically, the monitoring of services, making sure people are staying healthy, they have quality services and supports, they're using their natural and community resources, their activities are documented, their plans are reviewed at regular intervals, et cetera, et cetera. And on the right are all the things that a support broker might do in the self-directed arrangement. So, again, helping develop people's skills to self-direct, explaining the responsibilities of an employer, helping to development and document their spending plans, acting as a liaison between the person and the FMS provider, renewing the initial spending plans for modifications, acting as an advocate to get approval for the spending plan and budget, help recruiting workers, and or providing suggestions and advice about managing, but do not directly recruit, hire, supervise, dismiss themselves, only providing that information and assistance, help with Medicaid documentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the way that the waivers are written currently, the supports coordinator case manager has all of this on their plate. So some supports coordinators, case managers might be completely fine doing all of these things. Some of them might have a caseload that makes it pretty much impossible to do all these things. So the suggestion is, since we already have this as a service, you could utilize it to kind of help with a lot of these things. So states that have dedicated support brokers as part of their waivers are generally spending 8 to 10 hours a month with people in these arrangements to support them. Supports coordinator, case manager might spend an hour or a couple hours a month with somebody maybe. So this is something that, and again, as the person learns their roles and responsibilities and they can start doing things more independently, this amount of work would be reduced. But the idea is that the person is really supported to have a successful arrangement and they're able to do as much of this on their own as possible. Any more support broker questions?
We do have a question on who trains the broker if they are directly hired by the individual.
That is a good question.
Yeah.
I think that it's possible for the CMH to do the training, but I know that we're not at this point, but it would be nice as an independent support broker that they had knowledge of how all of this works to begin with. And I'm hoping we have one of the plans we submitted for our ARPA funds, if we get to use them, was a pilot on supports brokers. So if that gets approved, we will actually have at least one broker trained for each PIHP region, which then will be like a train the trainer model to be able to hire more support brokers per region. So if that goes through, we'll have a bigger cadre of brokers to choose from. But that's where we are right now.
That's another question that we get a lot is, where do you find, is there a pot of support brokers out there that we don't know about?
Not yet, but
No,
the real thing is a broker. So if you look in the Medicaid manual, a broker is really just someone that has knowledge about whatever the thing is that they're going to do to support the person. So you might actually hire a broker in a traditional service model. For example, maybe somebody is moving and they need support, finding a place, saving a down payment, figuring out how to get to furniture and all this stuff they need to move out into their own place, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it would be a limited time, maybe for that person-centered planning year, where that broker would help do that one task And then once that was done, then they wouldn't be needed anymore. The brokers in these arrangements might go, for some time. But again, the idea is as long as the person needs that support to do whatever kind of thing that they might need support with, then they would still have that broker until they can learn to be their own broker.
So we are getting more questions. The first one is, are there any qualifications to be a support broker?
High school diploma, knowledge of whatever it is that they're doing. So like that other example, if they're moving, they would need to have knowledge of what you would need to move and how to do that. In this case, you'd need knowledge of, self-directed arrangements and how they work. And then again, the brokers are supervised by that supports coordinator, case manager, not necessarily, supervised hands-on supervision, but that they're signing off on their progress notes as they come through and making sure that services are rendered as, cited in the plan of service. And then again, those whatever responsibilities that broker is going to have and whatever responsibilities the support coordinator case manager is going to have are kind of outlined in the plan as to whose is what role. So
in addition to, I'm just gonna like asterisks, in addition to the other basic Medicaid required qualifications for any provider, such as the background check and 18 years of age and those other things, obviously apply to brokers. There's a question on how the amount and the authorization of a broker is determined.
I think you're developing that based on, what the person's needs are. So, how much of the support are they going to need? What are they going to be able to do on their own? And what is the broker going to be able to help with? Sometimes, you have somebody who's, I guess, really nervous about, going into the arrangement and might need just support, trying to feel comfortable, when they first start. And then once they kind of get going and they understand what they're doing, you might be able to back off those services. But there's nothing saying that you have to have that broker, because again, as long as you're providing that information and assistance through that coordinator or case manager, it just means that there's going to be extra work involved with them. So it just depends on, so I guess if the coordinator already is spending, X amount of time and they feel like that time could be given to the broker, that might be a good way to figure out how much time to authorize for that broker.
And a question about, can a broker be a family member?
I don't believe there's anything in as long as they're not a legally responsible relative. I don't think there's anything in the Medicaid manual preventing that.
Right. I mean, and we see family members, often in support roles, like Laura, I think referenced the CMS language earlier about the type of support that people can have in these arrangements specific to self-D, and support brokers are not specific to self-D. That maybe they have a role, but it's not necessarily as a formal support broker. And a process question about who would complete the background check, an FMS or a CMH?
If it's part of their budget, the FMS can. So like an independent support broker would probably be part of the budget because they'd be self-directing that.
Yep.
If it's a CMH employee, then the CMH can do the credentialing.
And I want to add here, like support brokers in Michigan, we know are underutilized, I think is an understatement to say how they're used. So, as we hope to see them used more, we'll be able to work on more technical guidance and assistance around this topic for folks. I don't see any more questions. We can go on.
Okay. Does the SD model pay the professional services directly? And what about independent contractors? So the model of self-direction that you can hire an unpaneled professional is called a purchase of service agreement. These professionals are considered independent contractors. They must accept the Medicaid rate of pay and be willing to work inside a self-directed model using a very person-centered, family-driven, youth-guided approach to their work. The model is not paying for the services directly. The FMS service provider would pay these professionals directly after they submit a claim.
So can you back up to that slide?
Sure.
So I know that this talks specifically about professional services, but we also get a lot of questions on the purchase of service model. And I saw some earlier in the chat with a lot of very specific questions, and we can get like the qualifications in the background. We have some kind of sample forms for setting up those arrangements that we can get out to folks if you want them. Everything from like background checks, because these also, the purchase of service arrangements also apply to provider agencies that are not paneled. And we had a question earlier about the rates and what if that provider agency that is not paneled has a rate that's higher than what your community mental health pays. Like, can you pay them more? Like, that's typically a no. I mean, that's a negotiation that you have to partner with your CMH on, but in general, no. Like if that provider agency pays or charges $100 an hour, and that's way over what your rate is for that service for the CMH, that's not something that you're typically going to enter into. And you can't just, I don't want to say this wrong, but use an SD arrangement to get to a service like that.
Again, that's, you know, the equitable rate, right? If
Yep.
you're paying an in-panel provider, whatever, $50 a unit or something, or an encounter, whatever your rate is, then that person needs to be able to, or agency needs to be able to work into that same rate.
Yeah. And so there are, like we said, like some very specific forms that relate to those types of arrangements, you know, some kind of tweaked, you know, in general, we use an individual Medicaid provider agreement for the directly hired arrangements, but there's one that's a little different for these types of arrangements that we can share if folks are interested. Okay.
All right. Can a person choose more than one self-direction model at the same time? Say you want to contract with a professional for OT or psych services, but also direct hire your own staff. Of course, yes, absolutely. And it should be encouraged to do so if that is something a person would find valuable in their life and help them reach their life goals.
I will add a bit of a caveat to this as we get the questions typically related to CLS is, can I use two different models for my CLS services? So directly hire part of them and maybe use a contracted panel provider for the other part. And the technical answer is yes, but the realistic answer is that those can get really messy and have to be set up very thoughtfully with some very, very, very clear roles and responsibilities between the two. And they can get messy. So if the person really wants to do that, that's fine, but you need to make sure that we're going in clearly understanding the potential conflicts between the two different models being used.
Yep. How is the dollar amount per unit determined? So I stuck a picture from one of our earlier slides down in here. So the amount of one's budget is calculated based on the service rates and units that would be used as if the person was not self-directing. These rates are set by the CMH and typically calculated up through an authorization. And that gets you their estimated cost of service. The total amount will be set to the top of the budget amount. So when we talk about rates to set the budget, we're not talking about wages. The rates are used to set the range for the budget and is not the same as the employer choosing a wage that fits inside of that budget range.
Okay, so we have had this question repeatedly, and so I'm going to ask it here because it directly relates to that. So people have, many CMHs have different provider rates for the same service. It can range everywhere from $5.50 a unit to $10 a unit. How do they choose which unit rate to use?
So, and I assume that a lot of those rates are set by the level of need. So if you had a provider rate for quote unquote a high behavioral home or something like that, right? You would use the level of care that that person would receive in that traditional model. So if you were, like we talked about really early in this, if you were to place somebody at a provider, where would they go? What would their rate be without any self-directed arrangement?
I think that's not always the case for people, that the rates are not necessarily built on that basis. So, I mean, I'm not quite sure if we have a great response, or if you have, I guess I don't know if you do right now. But I mean, we know that a lot of rates vary for many different reasons.
Mm.
And they're not all need-based.
Well, for generally the big picture, we want to, so when you're kind of finding those parameters of that budget, all you're doing is trying to figure out if they were going to do traditional services, what would that cost be? So if you had to think about it without, they're not going to self-direct, they're not going to be able to hire their own, however they're doing this, then what would it cost to serve them? So that's where you're kind of setting that outer limit of your budget.
And there's a question on if the Milliman rates have anything to do with the rates that could be used.
You can use the standard cost allocation if that's what is desired, I suppose. That's what that's what it's there for, is to kind of give guidance to the field on, where those rates might be set at. And you'll notice in those cost allocations, there's no SD rate.
Okay, we have about 14 minutes left, so I think we're going to move on. And for those people who are still having questions about that, let's get together individually.
Okay. What if medical necessity is accepted by the CMH, but the CMH doesn't approve enough money to support the point of service? And related, with the authorization of services being approved on medical necessity, how is it that the individual can use units towards other authorized services within their plan or budget? Medical necessity identifies specific units. So the first question, once an IPOS is developed and signed, the units and rates for the amount, scope, and duration are considered medically necessary. And the amount of money used to support that budget is the same amount that is estimated to be spent on that person for the year. If there are services that are not included in the budget because the person is choosing not to self-direct that services, it can be negotiated to add that service into the budget in order to increase the available dollar amount of the budget. But by all other accounts, there will always be enough money to support the IPOS as long as the CMH is calculating the budget at equitable rates to those who are not self-directing their services. So there should always be money to support the IPOS, is the answer to the first one. Second one, medical necessity does not identify specific units, but specific amount, scope, and duration of services. Once a plan of service is developed, those services and their units are converted into a dollar amount, which is more flexible in its utilization. The budget translates units into an overall dollar amount that is controlled by the individual and their spending plan. Medical necessity now drives the top range of what can be spent by the individual, and how each dollar of that budget is spent is up to the person and what is planned in the IPOS. This flexibility is key to budget authority, which anyone choosing to self-direct or voucher has in the state of Michigan. In other words, budget authority allows someone to use dollars towards other services or goods in the plan of service. So similarly, how does dollars work for audits? Since audits look at amount, scope, and duration of units, audits look at the IPOS, which is required to show the amount, scope, and duration of services, which equals medical necessity. Once medical necessity is established, a budget agreed to, and the budget paid out through the FMS entity and has the same dollar amounts, and they are used to fund the services and budget items utilized as if the person were using a traditional service delivery model. So looking at whether or not the person received the services as written in their plan. So basically the auditors are looking at that amount, scope, and duration and that medical necessity and trying to find out if the person is receiving services as their plan states they need to receive those services. They're not looking at how the dollars are spent in a budget. Who trains the FMS staff on SD? There's a readiness tool found at the end of the technical guidance that to make sure a CMH has a way to ensure the FMS is able to perform their duties as required by MDHHS. The FMS is required to be knowledgeable and uphold the principles of self-determination. Should we have a list of things like training, mileage? I don't know what else can be included in a budget. How do we manage, or don't we? What else they might include in a specific services that we might not approve, like snow removal, a laptop, etc. Most services already have overhead built into the cost of the service, which is again why there must be an equitable rate for arrangements that support self-determination. As far as what might not be approved, once again, when an IPOS is signed, the services and other expenses are also approved. If someone is trying to include something not typically covered by Medicaid, use the person-centered planning process to define how that thing will enable a person to reach their goals. So again, when you're discussing the budget with people, you're including a discussion about training, mileage, benefits, and any other way that that person might want to flexibly spend their allocated resources. So with regard to the total budget versus the units used to create the budget, the CMH claims process is very limiting and linear and currently does not allow for this level of flexibility that would allow for the full utilization of the person's budget. What will change to make this happen? We need to build a budget to meet someone's needs, make sure they understand and can use their budget, and allow the FMS to do their jobs. Don't create a system that makes a barrier to using the budget. Excuse me. And the last one, I know an EIN, so an employee identification number, will be needed, but will an NPI, is that national provider indicator? No, identifier number be required? No, the employer needs an employer ID number, but they do not need a national provider identifier. Oh, it's right there, because they're not a provider. Typically, an NPI is needed to bill insurance against, but the employer record is not paid for the services of their employees, as a typical provider would be. Losing my voice, Marie. So the NPI is not necessary. An NPI may only be necessary for the professional providers in a purchase of service arrangement, as they would be billing claims to Medicaid.
Do you need me to take over?
Sorry.
Well, it's my turn anyway, so I guess I can take a break. So that is, we are really close to the end of our time for today. We do want to announce that as of tomorrow, not today, but tomorrow morning, our self-direction help desk will be live at the link in the presentation on the screen. So the help desk is there for folks who have questions or comments or feedback on what is going on with self-determination around the state, to please submit that to us. It's going to be monitored weekly. It's not intended, obviously, for crisis, and we have lots of fun disclaimers on that. So please don't use it in case of emergencies or it's not intended for individual advocacy or things like that, but we are going to be gathering the information. It will help us to inform future policy, to help us inform future webinars and technical assistance like this, training needs, all sorts of things that we'll use it for, and then to provide personal individual feedback if necessary to people around the field also.
And there'll be a kind of a repository for those frequently asked questions. So as questions come in, we'll make sure that those stay on that website. So you'll be able to go in and see if you have the same question that's already been asked before and get those answers. And then, if you don't see your question, you can just submit on this website, and we will either get the answer up on that FAQ or respond directly back to you depending on your needs. And then we also have a survey that we would like you all to do. So both of these links will get sent out with our follow-up email. Yep. So this is for any staff that's doing any kind of self-directed service support. And we really, really want to target, people that have self-directed arrangements. So I'll be sending out an email to the SD coordinators around the state with instructions to try and get these to the people who are actually self-directing. But please forward to your networks. We welcome people from the CMH or PHP that want to answer it, family members, etc. But we want to kind of get a feel for people's understanding of budget authority, what needs improvement, and what we can help with. And we're working on a project to get better budget authority across the state at this time. So this is kind of our initial first step at that. And then I have this slide, but we only have about 5 minutes left, it looks like. So I'm thinking if you have anything really pressing right now, or you can try out that website in the morning. Or
yes,
when we
in
get
the
link.
morning. Also on the website, you can find the recordings and the PDF for all of these webinar series, including not yet today's, but later on today's will all be linked on that same webpage for future reference. Angela Martin, who's helping with the survey, wanted to make sure we pointed out that it is for everyone, people with disabilities, family members, anyone working to support self-direction to take. And there's a question, if we have, now that we have that modifier, do we have any idea of how many people are currently self-directing in Michigan?
Oh, I wish I had known. I would have run
a
report. I'm guessing it's still around 8,000 or so, maybe, but I haven't run a report recently, so I will do that, and maybe I'll put it up on the help desk link, and then we'll have that information. So, and then if you go across programs, so when you include like home help and My Choice and all the other Medicaid programs, we're more like 30,000 plus 40,000, something like that across the state. So that's kind of, if you look at national numbers, they'll include everybody. So that's what you'll see is Michigan's like around 40,000 or something like that. So
I don't see more questions coming in. So we might be able to finish a couple of minutes early again. If you have feedback or thoughts on how self-direction is going in Michigan right now, please use the help desk. If you have suggestions for future trainings or technical assistance needs that you would like us to be aware of, again, please use that. Starting tomorrow.
Thank you so much, everybody. And like I had said at the beginning, we need you. So be brave, be bold, try things out. We're here to support you. So hopefully we can do great things together in the future. So thank you again for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.